At 80 years old, Pattie Boyd has decided to tell the truth. Not the polished fairy tale that the world once believed, but the raw, painful reality she lived through. For decades, she was celebrated as the golden muse of rock and roll, the woman who inspired some of the greatest love songs ever written: George Harrison's Something, Eric Clapton's Layla, and Wonderful Tonight. To the public, she seemed to embody beauty, romance, and the intoxicating glamour of the 1960s. But behind the songs, the magazine covers, and the perfect smiles was a very different story. A story of emotional neglect, infidelity, and betrayal. A story of a woman who gave up her career, her independence, and even her sense of self in the shadow of two men worshipped as geniuses. Now, at an age when most people look back quietly, Pattie chooses to speak loudly. She pulls back the curtain on a world of fame that was far less romantic than it appeared. What seemed like a dream life, being the muse of the Beatles guitarist, and later the love of Eric Clapton, was in truth a cycle of obsession, heartbreak, and humiliation. This is not the story of a muse, this is the story of survival. Pattie Boyd's journey began far from the lights of the stage. She was born Patricia Ann Boyd on March 17, 1944, in Somerset, England, the eldest of 4 children in a family marked by change and instability. Her father's service in the Royal Air Force took them as far as Nairobi, Kenya, before divorce fractured the family, and her mother moved the children back to England. By the early 1960s, Pattie was a restless teenager in London, searching for direction. Her first job was hardly glamorous, working as a shampoo girl in a beauty salon. But fate intervened when a photographer's assistant noticed her striking features. Soon after, she was swept into the world of high fashion. Within just a few years, Pattie Boyd's wide eyes, long blonde hair, and ethereal beauty were gracing the covers of Vogue, Elle, and Vanity Fair. She quickly became one of the most recognizable faces of the swinging 60s. Designers like Ossie Clark drew inspiration from her, and her effortless style, bohemian yet modern, helped define an entire cultural moment. But Pattie was never just another model. She became a symbol of the new era: youth, freedom, and rebellion wrapped in elegance. Still, what she couldn't have known was that her life was about to take a dramatic turn. Because in 1964, she landed a small role in a film that would change everything. On the set of A Hard Day's Night in 1964, Pattie's life changed forever. Among the chaos of screaming fans and flashing cameras, she caught the eye of George Harrison, the Beatles' quiet one. Their attraction was instant, and though Pattie was dating someone else at the time, George's charm and persistence eventually won her over. Just 2 years later, on January 21, 1966, Pattie and George were married. To the outside world, it was the ultimate love story: a stunning model, wedded to one of the most famous musicians on the planet. Harrison adored her, writing songs that would echo through generations, something later hailed by Frank Sinatra as the greatest love song of the past 50 years was written for her. So too was For You Blue, cementing her place as one of rock history's most celebrated muses. Yet even in those early years, the cracks were forming. George's growing obsession with Indian spirituality began to consume him, leaving Pattie feeling left behind. He spent long periods in India, absorbed in meditation and Eastern philosophy, while she struggled with loneliness. At his request, she gave up her modeling career, hoping it would strengthen their bond. Instead, it left her confined to the role of a dutiful wife, unseen, unheard, and increasingly unhappy. Pattie later admitted that she felt like a decorative accessory, not a partner. The woman once celebrated on magazine covers was now trapped in silence inside Friar Park, the grand but isolating Harrison estate. And in that silence, a longing began to grow, for love, for attention, for validation, a longing that would eventually draw her into the orbit of another man. Eric Clapton first met Pattie Boyd in the mid-1960s, moving in the same glittering circles of London's rock and fashion elite. By then, he was already carving out a reputation as one of the most gifted guitarists of his generation. From the Yardbirds to Cream, his virtuosity had earned him the nickname Slow Hand. But while Clapton's career soared, his personal life was haunted by a secret he could no longer contain. He had fallen hopelessly in love with Pattie. The complication? She was the wife of his closest friend, George Harrison. Clapton's obsession was no secret among those around him. Friends recalled how he spoke endlessly about her, tormented by the impossibility of his feelings. In 1969, his longing spilled onto paper in an anonymous love letter signed simply with the letter E. It was filled with desperation and raw desire, a plea to be taken, or else freed from the spell she had cast on him. For Pattie, the words were overwhelming. She was shaken, confused, and flattered, but still married to George. She chose loyalty, showing the letter to her husband. Yet Clapton's anguish only deepened. That anguish soon transformed into music. In 1970, Clapton poured his obsession into one of rock's greatest albums, Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs. Inspired by a 12th century Persian tale of forbidden love, the title track Layla became his searing confession. It was passion, despair, and longing turned into sound, and the entire world could hear it. For Pattie, Layla was impossible to ignore. She later confessed that the song broke her resolve. The realization that I had inspired such passion and creativity, the song got the better of me. I could resist no longer. What began as a dangerous temptation was now undeniable, and as her marriage to George Harrison grew colder, Clapton's devotion burned hotter. By the early 1970s, the fairy tale of Pattie Boyd and George Harrison had begun to unravel. What had once seemed like a dream marriage, a Beatle and his muse, was slowly corroded by distance, neglect, and betrayal. George's immersion in Eastern spirituality, which had initially inspired them both, soon became a lifestyle that left Pattie excluded. He spent long stretches in India, meditating and immersing himself in the Hare Krishna movement, while she remained at Friar Park, feeling invisible and forgotten. Loneliness, however, was only part of the pain. George's flirtations with female admirers escalated into open affairs. Pattie described him as a hot-blooded boy who relished the attention fame brought. But the cruelest wound came when she discovered he was having an affair with Maureen Starkey, the wife of his bandmate and friend Ringo Starr. Pattie recalled the humiliation vividly, walking into Friar Park to find Maureen lying casually on a mattress, while George brushed off her presence with chilling indifference. That moment, she admitted, left a scar that never truly healed. Meanwhile, Eric Clapton could no longer bear to love her in silence. In 1970, he confronted George directly, declaring, "I have to tell you, man, I'm in love with your wife." It was a shocking admission, one guitarist bearing his heart to another, knowing full well the stakes. The rivalry between the two men soon spilled into their music. Actor John Hurt once described witnessing what seemed like a guitar duel at Friar Park. Harrison and Clapton trading riffs laced with jealousy, anger, and unspoken tension. Pattie would later downplay the legend of that duel, but she admitted the emotions were real. By 1974, the marriage had become intolerable. Between neglect, betrayal, and the gnawing emptiness of life as the Beatles' wife, Pattie finally walked away. After nearly a decade, her chapter with George Harrison was over. After years of longing, pursuit, and tortured declarations, Eric Clapton finally won the woman he had obsessed over. By 1977, after her divorce from George was finalized, Pattie and Eric began openly dating. 2 years later, on March 27, 1979, they were married in Tucson, Arizona. Even George Harrison attended the ceremony. With remarkable irony, or perhaps resignation, he joked that Eric was now his husband. To the public, this unusual bond symbolized forgiveness, friendship, and the triumph of true love. For Pattie, it seemed like the long-awaited happy ending after years of pain. But behind the wedding smiles, the reality was far more complicated. Clapton's demons had not disappeared. Though he had fought his way through heroin addiction, alcoholism soon took its place. His drinking binges, mood swings, and erratic behavior poisoned the marriage. Pattie once again found herself living in a cycle of uncertainty, trapped between moments of tenderness and storms of chaos. She hoped that starting a family might bring stability. Together, she and Eric turned to in vitro fertilization, desperate to have a child. But each attempt ended in heartbreak. Pattie later described the treatments as humiliating and emotionally draining, a private agony she endured in silence. And while she suffered, Eric betrayed her in the cruelest way possible. In 1985, Pattie discovered that he had fathered a daughter, Ruth, with recording studio manager Yvonne Kelly. Just a year later, another child was born, a son, Connor, with Italian actress Lori Del Santo. Both affairs occurred while Pattie was still struggling through failed IVF treatments, making the betrayal cut even deeper. She would later say it felt like fate was mocking her. She had given everything to the man she loved, only to be replaced in the one way that mattered most to her. By the mid-1980s, their marriage was collapsing under the weight of addiction, betrayal, and broken dreams. In 1987, Pattie left Clapton. 2 years later, the divorce was final, and once again she was left shattered, asking herself a painful question. I was no longer Mrs. Famous George or Mrs. Famous Eric. Who was I? I was no one. When Pattie Boyd walked away from Eric Clapton in 1987, she was not just leaving a broken marriage, she was leaving behind 2 decades of being defined by the men in her life. For years, she had been George Harrison's wife, then Eric Clapton's obsession. She had been the muse, the beauty, the inspiration. But who was she without them? The answer did not come easily. Pattie admitted that her sense of self-worth was shattered. Years of comparison, first to George's endless affairs, then to Eric's infidelities, had left deep scars. Therapy helped her begin untangling the pain, but true healing came through creativity. Photography, once a private passion, became her lifeline. Behind the camera, Pattie found her own voice. Her photographs captured not only the icons she had known, but also her own quiet journey of survival. The images were intimate, raw, and deeply personal, and in time, her work gained recognition. Exhibitions in London and abroad proved that she was more than a muse, she was an artist in her own right. Writing brought another wave of liberation. In 2007, Pattie released her memoir, Wonderful Tonight, George Harrison, Eric Clapton, and Me. The book was brutally honest, peeling back the myth of glamour to reveal the loneliness, betrayal, and pain she had endured. It became an international bestseller, shocking fans who had long idealized her marriages. But for Pattie, it wasn't about scandal. It was about reclaiming her story after years of silence. Through art and words, she found a way to stitch herself back together. And for the first time in decades, Pattie Boyd was no longer standing in the shadows of rock gods. She was standing as herself. By the time Pattie entered her 70s, the chaos of her past was behind her. After decades of being entangled in the storms of fame, obsession, and betrayal, she was finally free to live life on her own terms. In 2015, she quietly married Rod Weston, a property developer and longtime friend. Their ceremony at Chelsea Old Town Hall was intimate and understated, a stark contrast to the spectacle of her earlier marriages. There were no screaming fans, no rockstar chaos, no tabloids circling for scandal. This time, her union was built on something far simpler and more enduring: companionship, peace, and mutual respect. For Pattie, it was the first relationship not defined by obsession or betrayal. With Rod, she found stability, the calm she had been searching for all her life. After years of heartbreak, she could finally exhale. By now, she was no longer remembered only as the muse behind Something or Layla. Through her photography, her writing, and her courage to speak openly, she had reclaimed her own identity. She was no longer Mrs. George Harrison. She was no longer Mrs. Eric Clapton. She was simply Pattie Boyd, artist, author, and survivor. At 80 years old, Pattie Boyd looks back on her life with a perspective few could imagine. To the outside world, she will always be remembered as the woman who inspired Something, Layla, and Wonderful Tonight, 3 of the most enduring love songs in rock history. But for Pattie, those songs no longer define her story. She now speaks openly about the truth behind the myth, that her marriages to George Harrison and Eric Clapton were not fairy tales, but cycles of neglect, betrayal, and pain. What the world saw as glamour was for her often loneliness. What seemed like devotion was in reality obsession. And what appeared to be love was too often clouded by addiction, infidelity, and heartbreak. Yet Pattie's revelations are not meant to invite pity. They are acts of reclamation, her way of taking back the narrative after a lifetime of being spoken for by others. She has confronted the myths, dismantled the illusions, and shown the world that behind the music was a woman who suffered, endured, and ultimately survived. Today, Pattie is celebrated not just as a muse, but as an artist and a voice of her own. Her photography exhibitions have earned international recognition, and her memoir remains a powerful testament to honesty and resilience. With Rod Weston, she has found the peace and stability she never had in her youth. At last, Pattie Boyd stands not as a footnote in the lives of rock legends, but as a survivor who reclaimed her identity. Her legacy is no longer defined by the men who once adored her. It is defined by the strength it took to tell her truth, unfiltered, painful, and necessary. Pattie Boyd's story is more than the tale of a muse. It is a reminder that behind every legend, behind every love song, there is a real human being, one who feels, suffers, and fights to be seen. She may have inspired the greatest music of her generation, but her greatest achievement was finding the strength to step out of the shadows and claim her own voice. At 80, Pattie Boyd is no longer defined by the men who once wrote about her. She is defined by survival, resilience, and truth. And in telling that truth, she has given us something more lasting than any song, the courage to face the past, and the power to write our own story.